Spiritual Christianity by Charles Augustus Tulk. Chapter 1, point number 10. The word infinite, in its primitive meaning, is literally not finite. And in contradistinction to space, something which is not spatial. The word eternal, as used in a philosophical sense by Swedenborg, implies not the progression of time without a beginning, for such essential eternity is as much a non-entity as infinite space, or space without a boundary, but on the contrary, that which is not progressive. Progression necessarily involves change of some kind or other, either internal or external, either in the thoughts and affections of the mind or in the objects of the senses in space. For change imparts the consciousness of progression to life, and the consciousness of progression is time. But as there is no change in the entire and full perfection of the Divine Esse, there be no time or progression of life in him. His life is not a progressive life, for he has no succession of changes either in himself or present to him, and for this reason it is that the mode of his eternal being is not to be comprehended by a finite creature, the consciousness of whose life depends upon a succession of changes. In the strictly negative sense in which Swedenborg uses those two terms, infinity is the complete absence of space, or the extension in the Lord Jehovah such as he is in himself, and eternity is a complete absence of time or progression. The mode of his being is neither progressive nor extended. Point number 11. So long as the extension of space and the duration of time be considered as actually indispensable to being, it is not possible for any man to avoid falling into the most dangerous perplexities whenever he thinks of the divine infinity and eternity. To deprive a being of the two properties of nature, space and time, would, in the opinion of such a person, be to annihilate him, and therefore his divine being is infinite and eternal, not because he is utterly devoid of space and time, but because he fills the boundless space which he has created with his presence, and because he has endured from eternity, or through ages of time which had no beginning. The dangerous perplexities which distract the mind in its investigation of these subjects whenever it thinks from space and time are strikingly shown in the answers to the inquiry, which so frequently suggests itself to the naturalist, and which he is unable rationally to solve. What was God doing before he began to create? If he assumed the divine life to be a progressive life and not a life devoid of all progression, and that there was a beginning to creation, then the conclusion will inevitably be that before he began to create, he must have remained from eternity inactive. But his mind, it is more than probable, will at times recoil at the supposition of a perfect being remaining from eternity inactive, and then he will flee to this other extreme of absurdity, that as the divine love and wisdom must have been ever operative, creation never could have had a beginning and was consequently as much eternal as the Creator himself. Out of the obscurity of this sensual labyrinth, Swedenborg has endeavoured, and successfully endeavoured, if we are on our parts to dispose to follow his directions, to extricate the mind. He nowhere endeavours to deter his reader from the investigation, by representing the mystery as placed on a height which we can never hope to reach, and as if it were dangerous even to make the attempt, lest despair of success should be followed by doubt and denial. No, he shows that the danger lies not in taking the right path, but in taking the wrong. He would turn therefore our steps from that dark maze towards which they are naturally directed, and will lead us by a gentle and yet invigorating ascent to an eminence where in a brighter atmosphere we should find every object clear and beautiful before us. Here we may be sure there is neither difficulty nor danger, for these will have vanished like shadows of the night so soon as ever we have ceased to think of the divine infinity and eternity from nature, with which the Lord Jehovah has nothing in common, and no longer invest with supposed reality two imaginary non-entities, which we choose to call infinity of space and eternity of time. This indeed is perilous, for this is to confound God and nature by having a natural idea of the infinite and eternal God. But there is neither difficulty in acquiring nor danger in possessing the truth that infinity is the absence of all space or extension, and eternity the absence of all time or progression. That time and space, as we shall hereafter find, are properties that exist only for the finite mind, being produced by its imperfect reception of the infinite and eternal. Point number 12. But Swedenborg does not stop here. Having shown that space and time are only applicable to man in nature, he instructs his reader further that those mental changes which he calls states of love and wisdom, states of goodness and of truth, and frequently by the single word state, meaning by state the condition of the mind, being essential to forms imperfectly receptive of the divine life, cannot be attributed to the one perfect being such as he is in himself. Not only then is the Divine Esse devoid of the imperfection which is involved in sensuous extension and progression, but of internal states also. For states of love and wisdom depend upon changes in the imperfect condition of the will and of the intellect, and he can have no changes either of love or of wisdom, for he receives not anything from another, but is himself the fullness of perfection. All variations and changes are effects produced in the recipient of the divine life and according to its state. Point 13. Swedenborg, in his Universal Theology, has also spoken of the divine immensity, using the word immensity in the same sense as he does infinity in other parts of his writings. But as the divine immensity, from the corrupt use of the word immense, is even more liable to be misunderstood than infinity, it may be necessary to call the attention of the reader to its signification, as it is explained by the author himself. Point 14. God is not called immense in the vulgar acceptation of this term, as if he were a body of great magnitude, filling, as some persons imagine, the universe, or else, as others conjecture, occupying a certain central spot, from which, as from a throne, he beholds, directs, and governs all things. These are dreamy fantasies, fitted only for the sensuous, who deem space and extension to be essential to the divine being, and who, in imagination, forms to himself a God, differing from a finite natural being in space only by his greater magnitude and his superior power. In God, Swedenborg says, there is no space, and therefore, not being extended, he cannot have a body occupying space. He is not called immense on account of his magnitude, but because the initiatants of space are from him, who in himself is wholly devoid of all magnitude. He is called immense because there is nothing partaking of the nature of space which can be the measure of his perfection, and yet, as is the inmost cause of all that is, he must be the cause of space also. Immensity, then, has no reference to space and extension, except as denoting their spaceless or unextended cause. Point 15. Swedenborg says, besides of the Divine Esse, that he is the essential substance and the essential form. But as these terms substance and form are very commonly misunderstood and misapplied, it will be necessary for the reader to bear in mind that neither the one nor the other is to be understood in its ordinary sense, but in a sense wholly abstracted from space, and from every one of the properties which belong to bodies in space. The word substance is usually applied to every natural object which offers a resistance to the touch, and in what has been erroneously called its metaphysical sense, the substance of nature is a supposed substratum in which the properties of matter are thought to inhere. In neither of these senses does Swedenborg use the word when he speaks of the divine substance. The Divine Esse, or Jehovah, such as he is in himself, is the essential substance, not because he is in himself objective either to touch or any of the other senses, nor because he is a substratum for the properties of matter, for on the one supposition he would be finited by space and time, and on the other be nothing more than what is frequently called the inmost principle of nature. But he is substance itself, or the universal substance, because, being the one only cause in whom all creation originates, he, by his omnipresence, sustains them in being. To suppose that he has any one property belonging to bodies in space, every property of which represents the imperfection of the finite, or to suppose him to be the immediate substratum of natural objects, is to identify him with his creatures and with the created universe, and in the latter case to degrade him into some hypothetical principle spread abroad through the infinite space of the materialist. Point number 16. By this word, substance, therefore, when applied to the Divine Esse, is meant the one sustaining life of all that is created. The conclusion that the Divine Esse is such a substance is to be drawn not from any fancied insight into his infinite perfections, but from the constitution of created beings. For the mind sees it to be a constituent of all finite things which have a present existence and a progressive life that they begin to be, and therefore it concludes the same of all finite beings. But as no existent thing can of itself arise from non-existence, for such a supposition involves an absurdity, therefore beginning to be supposes an improgressive being from whom they begin, or who calls them forth into being. But the same power that creates must be constantly exerted to preserve in being that which is created, or else, as it has no more inherent or essential power of continuing to be than it had of beginning to be, it must inevitably fall back into non-entity. This power of sustaining all things in being, which is a perpetual creation, belongs to the property which is called the divine substance. Point number 17. It is not possible to think of the Lord Jehovah's sustaining by his omnipresence all bodies in space, if we consider space to be an extraneous thing, created to be independent of man, and not at the same time conclude that God must so far partake of the nature of those bodies, which he supports, as to have magnitude. And accordingly such persons as think of the creation of the universe from space and time invariably conceive of the divine omnipresence, that it is a pervading presence in space, co-enduring with the bodies which he supports in existence. But if they are told that the divine being is not extended, and has not even the extension of space present with him, they are then utterly at a loss in what way to reconcile the creation and preservation of all bodies in space with the omnipresence of a spaceless or unextended creator. How space and time, when they are supposed to have an existence as independent of man as they are extraneous to him, should neither be present to the substantial cause of both, nor enter into the constituent of his being, seems to be a mystery past finding out. But these are difficulties which are incidental only to that false view of creation, which consists in seeing it from space and time, and not from state. By doing so, we cannot avoid connecting these two properties of nature with the Creator, and in imagination thinking of him as existing in space and as enduring in time. But to perceive the creation of the universe from state is to perceive that all things in nature are produced by the medium of man as a percipient being, that is, through the state of the human will and intellect to which they correspond, and of the imperfection of which they become, in consequence of such production, the representative's outbirth. Thus we are enabled mentally to distinguish between the infinity and eternity of the Creator and the space and time of nature, which, being created through man, are the representative symbols and at the same time the effects of his imperfect condition, and can therefore neither be in the divine being nor present to him. But if spaces and time be supposed to have existed independent of all finite conscious beings, then must they have been present with the divine being, and he must have been in them as their immediate cause. But he is not extended, and therefore cannot be in space, and he is not mutable, and therefore cannot be in time. Point 18. Lastly, we have that remarkable passage in which the author speaks of the one only substance as ruling in all things that are formed from it, not only as form, but also as non-form, such as form in its origin. To understand this passage, which appears at first sight not a little enigmatic, it would be necessary to give a definition of form in relation both to the mind and to the natural bodies in space, and then we shall be able to see how clearly it is, or in what sense it is declared, that form, considered in its origin or essence, is devoid of form. The form of a natural body in space is the general boundary to any object which the senses perceive, by which it is presented as a whole and distinguished from other natural forms. Thus, if we speak of the human form, we mean as an object of sight, that visible periphery or circumference with the interjacent subdivisions of colour, light, and shadow called the head, the trunk, and the limbs, which, by continuity of sensation, is presented to the mind as a one or whole. Considered as an object of touch, the human form consists of the qualities of hard and soft, warm and cold, rough, smooth, plain, and spherical, which, modified and arranged after a certain determinate manner, are present to the sense of touch. These sensations, as they pass from one into another, or are blended together, are comprehended by the mind, and these, in the peculiar order of their gradations, and in connections with the quality of sight, it embraces as a whole and calls the human form. Form, in relation to the human mind, as it is not an object capable of being presented to the sight, or touch, or any of the other senses, must be conceived abstractly from the conditions which belong to bodies in space. The form of the mind is a concurrent determination of the mental powers to specific uses, by which it is presented as a whole and distinguished from other forms, that is, from other minds. Point number 20. But it is essential to form, whether of mind or body, that it be finite or limited and imperfect. All natural forms are limited in their presence and mutable in their appearance, and cannot therefore be predicated of the divine being such as he is in himself, for he is omnipresent, but not in space, and is not subject to those progressive changes which are presented to the mind as time. The same is true of spiritual forms, or the forms of the human will and intellect, for they are the limitations of the mind by the peculiar disposition and extent of its powers to specific purposes, by which each mind has its own character or province and is determined to certain uses in preference to others. This specific determination of the powers of the mind is its form. But the divine mind is infinite and universal, and it is neither limited in its essence nor in its operation, and therefore it is rightly said that form in its origin is non-form or is devoid of form, which is the same thing as saying that it is devoid both of the limitations and imperfections inherent in space and time, or in natural forms, and also of the imperfect state or condition of spiritual forms. But still, the Divine Esse is to be considered as the essential form, and that in a like supereminent sense as he is called the beginning and the end, the first and the last, not because there is in him any one of the imperfections which give to mind and body their peculiar forms, but because in him alone are the initiaments of all form. Point 21. The Lord Jehovah is the essential substance, because the spaceless omnipresence of his life sustains all things in being, and he is the essential form, because the specific determination and coordination of all forms, whether spiritual or natural, have their initiaments in him. Point 22. Such are the spiritual truths contained in the theological writings of Swedenborg on the Divine Esse, or the divine being such as he is in himself. It will be necessary for the reader to comprehend and bear this steadily in mind, that considered absolutely, God is incomprehensible, that he can be known by no quality, because all qualities or properties must be drawn from a finite source, that they may be seen and appreciated by a finite mind. But we shall hereafter see that this same being, who is the creator of all, and who imparts to all that conscious life of love and thought and sensation, by which they exist distinct from him, and yet in perpetual dependence upon him, who forever sustains them in existence, reveals himself to his creatures in a way which they can comprehend, and by comprehending, mentally approach and love. Point 23. But previous to this, other spiritual truths of the highest value must be known, and especially those which explain the constitution of the mind and the laws of its progression, and also what those two states of life are, which go by the names of the natural and the spiritual worlds. For it should be known that these two worlds stand in close connection with one another, so close indeed that the one is but a continuation of the other, and yet so distinct that in the ordinary condition of his mind, man cannot pass from one into the other, except by the final transition, which is called death. Death, so far as the consciousness of the individual is concerned, is but a continuation of life, the sole difference being that instead of a natural life, consisting of natural thoughts, natural affections, and natural sensations, if, by that previous preparation in this life, which is called man's regeneration, he enters heaven, his affections, thoughts, and sensations all become spiritual. The meaning of those two terms, spiritual and natural, will be explained, and what those worlds are, which are usually called by those names, and what the laws of their creation are. These must first be known and well understood to enable the reader to understand what those manifestations are of the Divine Esse, which Swedenborg calls the Lord's divine humanity, and in what way it is produced. In the course of these explanations, many other spiritual truths of value will be introduced. the whole forming the most perfect system, and indeed the only perfect system of spiritual Christianity that was ever revealed to man. All former systems of Christianity were necessarily defective, for the world was not prepared for anything better or more rational. They served their turn, and having sunk into the grossness of an irrational polytheism and into a dangerous substitute for that regeneration of the mind which was required for the enjoyment of heaven, another system became necessary, in which, by the opening of the Word of God in its spiritual sense, the true object of worship and the state of mind which is necessary for worship are revealed, and in connection with these truths, what the two sensuous worlds are, which are called the spiritual and natural world, and in what way they are brought forth and sustained in existence, and the laws of their changes. All these things are most clearly, and to the candid mind, satisfactorily explained in the following chapters. Whatever there may be to startle, and at first sight to puzzle, the mind accustomed only to the grovelling fallacies which pass current for truths in the Christian world, will gradually disappear as it becomes accustomed to a spiritual mode of thinking, and as the reason becomes convinced by having the grounds of spiritual truth distinctly laid before it.